Associated Press story chronicles how outraged these jurors were by the government's own testimony about what happened at Waco to the Branch Davidians. Now understand, this is after the trial is over. The newspaper establishment, in this particular story, it's the Associated Press, is asking the jurors, what did they think? What comments do they have? They were just fit to be tied. It turns out that those tanks that we watched on the day of the assault, the final assault when there was the big fire and everything, those tanks that we watched on television were not just poking holes in the wall to insert gas into the structure. This is a residence that's occupied by men, women, and children, yet those tanks that we saw, according to this trial testimony, the government's testimony, those tanks were ordered to penetrate this residence occupied by men, women, and children. The government's strategy as described at the trial by the government itself was to bring this structure down. This is a residence occupied by men, women, and children. Our government, that is supposed to be based on the ideals of freedom and liberty, justice for all, our government instructed its government agents to climb into tanks and roll those tanks right into a structure that's occupied with men, women, and children. And as a result, some of the children that we were told the government was saving died as the structure came down and crushed skulls. They died from blunt force trauma to their skulls. It's like this. For people who are wondering, how come there's a militia movement that's growing in this country? Well, it used to be, I'm over 50. I was 52, just had a birthday just here recently. And we used to use the phrase up in arms as sort of a metaphor. It was kind of a joking metaphor. People are up in arms about this or that. But when you have a government that orders its agents to get into tanks and run those tanks through a residence occupied by men, women, and children, and then there are no indictments. There's no indictment of the tank drivers. There's no indictment of the people who ordered the tank drivers. There's no indictment of any of the high officials. At that point, the truce has broken down, and the phrase "up in arms," the people are up in arms, is the only thing that's left for them as a reality, instead of it being a metaphor. So yeah, you have a growing militia movement because we now have a government that isn't technically violating the Constitution or technically creating injustices. We've got a government now that does it in a big way, does it on television, doesn't even get to sweep it under the rug, testifies at trial that what it did was order its agents to get into tanks and run the tanks through a residence occupied by men, women, and children, and there are no indictments of any of these people. At the very least, they should be indicted for manslaughter, if not murder. We haven't had that happen, and that's why you have a militia movement that's growing in this country. They see a government that may, depending on which aspect of the militia you ask, there's going to be different things that bother them, and maybe you won't agree with them on this issue or that issue. But the one point that we can all agree on is you cannot have a government that just arbitrarily kills people, runs tanks through houses, and not even have the agents who drove the tanks be indicted. You cannot have that. At that point, there is no more choice. You have to be up in arms. You have to be ready to deal with that government in the same way that it's dealing with their citizens. Now, I'm not advocating that we raise an army and go storm Washington, D.C. No, this is not a question of going in and invading. This is a question of people feeling the need to be ready to protect themselves with deadly force if they have to against a government that has gone outlaw. To the Branch Davidians, I would say you've been treated in a way that no human being should be treated, let alone people on American soil. This is an outrage. This cannot be allowed to stand. I am very pleased that Jeff Davis has been pursuing this issue in public access TV. This isn't an issue that's going to be pushed by the establishment media. This is Terry Liberty Parker, hardcore libertarian in Austin, Texas.